This map will just be interesting, useful for you for studying. It covers everything from units 7, 8, and 9. So it's not like we're going to go through all this stuff today. It's not like you need to know all this stuff today. But by the end of those 50-odd days, the vast majority of this, at least, should make sense to you. So I just kind of wanted to share it with you now so you can get a sense of where we're going. And also, I guess, to just get a sense of what you know already and where your strengths are already. So 7-1, this first unit is, as you see there, shifting power after 1900. I do want to, I know I don't really read off of these too much, but I want to point out this because I don't really talk about it anywhere else in these slides, and it's kind of an important point for you to understand, is that coming into the 20th century, so starting in 1900, the West was clearly in a dominant position globally. I think you guys have a sense of that by now. We've talked about the map. I've talked about the 7 flags that controlled almost the entire map, or 8 if you want to add in the Ottoman Empire. Yes, it's not the West, but the point is the West had a disproportionate amount of power. By the end of the 20th century, so by 1999 technically, but by today, the Western dominance has not gone away. There is Western dominance, but it's not as pronounced, it's not as extreme, and in fact, power is shifting away from Western civilization, I would say, back toward China as a global power. And so that's a big takeaway, and what I just don't want to get missed is that in this 100 years, in the 100 years, the most recent 100 years is basically what we're talking about, the shift has been pretty dramatic. And I hope you remember that chart I showed you with GDP, and it basically showed, particularly China was interesting, how China was huge, and then has this period where it gets very, very, very small, where China's really poor, basically, and then starts growing again back to today, where China's growing in wealth and will surpass us as the largest economy by the end of this decade. All right? So that's the kind of main story. The CED has a in depth on the Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire, Qing Dynasty, and Mexico, so that's what I'm going to do in these slides as we kind of go forward. This is the Freemanpedia slide, so this shows you those 4 that we're going to talk about, people you might want to know, and kind of what the transitions were. Mexico, from Mexico to Mexico, Ottoman Empire to Turkey, Russia to USSR, and then the Qing Dynasty to the Republic of China, and then to the People's Republic of China. Now today I'm really, like I said, today's World War I, but I'm going to talk a little bit beyond World War I, just so you get a full sense of each of these. And so these 4 slides are going to take, because I'm going to go through this and kind of explain my logic and why I picked what I picked to put on here. First of all, let me say that this map I know is a little bit blurry, but it was kind of the best I could find for what I was trying to say, so I'll explain what the point of this is. And I want to also, just so in case you're not great with maps and need some kind of guidance, this right here, this is Constantinople or Istanbul now, and this, if you look at this little this little lake right here that's underneath it, not really like, I guess it's a sea technically. This little sea that's underneath it, that's the same sea right here. Okay, so this right here, all of this right here, just kind of off to the side here, basically. And so what you need to understand is, as we come into 1900, and you should kind of have a sense of this already, the Ottoman Empire is quickly losing territory. It's quickly shrinking and beginning its final kind of collapse into what would become Turkey. So in 1876, there was an Ottoman constitution drafted, and it was in effect for 2 years. It expanded freedoms. It included more popular participation, more ways for people to be involved in the decision-making process. And it was in effect for 2 years before it was no longer the law of the land, and before it was kind of a return to a more authoritarian type kind of setup. During that same time, roughly, is when the Russo-Turkish War happened. And that's when Russia started taking territory that they invaded in the Caucasus, and I believe they were also fighting over here. So Russia was kind of hitting them on 2 sides, but most territory losses are going to be on the Caucasus on this side. In 1908, you have the Young Turk Revolution. You should remember the Young Turks from the reading that we did. And in 1908, they reinstated this constitution. So brought that back in, forced the leaders to accept that constitution and the expanding freedom that meant. That only lasted, though, for about 4 years. You can see in 1912 and 1913, there were coups in both of those years. A military coup and then another authoritarian type coup, basically. In those same years, those same 2 years is when the two Balkan Wars happened. So these are the Balkans, remember. All this territory loss was, not all of it, but a lot of it was during the same time. The rest would happen in World War I. Greece is long gone by now. So all of this territory, by the time we get through here, or the vast majority of this territory is gone. And they still control a little bit in here, basically. And on this side, too, they've lost territory. So they're losing, getting smaller and smaller. They still control, though, to their south. So they still control the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa, kind of. Remember, Egypt kind of is in a different state. But there still is control to the south for now. Balkan Wars in 1913. In 1914, the Ottomans enter World War I. They enter World War I on the side of the Germans and the Austrians, and that's the Central Powers is what we'll call them, and kind of what they're called. And if you think about it, it makes sense because they're fighting against the British, the French, and the Russians. Well, certainly you understand why they would want to fight against the Russians. But they also had pressure in Africa, but also in Southwest Asia and the Middle East from France and Britain, who were trying to encroach on their territory. In fact, you'll see the ultimate result here of World War I was that the French and British took a bunch of their territory to the south. And so they had a natural reason to want to fight people. They had less of a natural reason to want to team up with the Germans and the Austrians, because there had been some conflict with them as well, but not really as much. Soon after World War I begins, the Armenian Genocide begins. If you open up the Wikipedia on the Armenian Genocide, it says 1915 to present. So arguably it's still going on, but it was much worse toward the start when we had less of a concern for human rights. But still not great, and still to this day, it's an oppressed group in Turkey. 1916 is when you have the Battle of Gallipoli. Now, first, the Ottomans were successful in kind of repelling Allied forces from taking over, but eventually the Allies did get the upper hand. And 2 years later, World War I's over, the Ottoman Empire is defeated, and then they immediately go into this period of the Turkish War of Independence. Now, the Turkish nationalists, who were led by Kemal Atatürk, they were fighting not only against the Russians and the French and the British and these powers that were trying to basically erase the Ottoman Empire from the map, they were also fighting the remnant of the Ottoman Empire because they did not want to go back to that style of nation, of that style of government. They wanted a modern European style government, basically, and that's what Ataturk was pushing for. You may see this term Kemalism or Kemalism. That refers to his leadership style and his pushing for reforms and modernization. Now, it's not all a good story. I mean, there was, they adopted the Gregorian calendar, there was expansion of rights for women, there was kind of less, they got rid of the religious schools and moved to secular education, stuff like that. From that point onward, the Hagia Sophia wasn't a mosque, it was a museum. Now, recently, just last year, it was turned back into a mosque because there's a pretty conservative government that's kind of moving in a different direction than that. But that shows you that relevance and that connection to. But anyway, they enter this period of civil war or war of independence, and by 1923, that's over, and Ataturk is the first president of Turkey. Okay. In between this time, you have the treaty kind of formalizing the breakup of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, and that's what this map shows you is how it was broken up. And really, the kind of only territory that remained in Ottoman control is what you see in yellow here. All right, everything else was given to someone else, and then eventually Turkey was able to take back control of the Anatolian Peninsula afterwards. In 1945, Turkey ended up entering World War II, this time, though, on the other side. They joined on the side of the Allies. So I just think that's kind of interesting. Oh, also, let me just, I kind of was sleeping on this yesterday, too. So the pink, of course, at the top is the CED content. So what I want you to understand for the Ottoman Empire is that their collapse was a mix of internal, right? You have this internal fighting of coups and revolution, a civil war. So internal factors, but also external factors. You have the French, the British, and the Russians in particular causing a lot of problems for the Ottoman Empire and later Turkey. In Russia, there was revolution that ends up leading to the USSR and the communist state that would exist. So in some of these, by the way, I've just put people's either reigns or the years they were alive if they weren't a leader. It's a little bit kind of confusing, I realize. But so Tsar Nicholas II, this is actually his reign. So he was the last Tsar. He was the last emperor of Russia. Lenin was not emperor or not technically in charge, but he certainly was a leader. And these are actually his life. So it's the point I'm trying to get at here is that these two are kind of concurrent, roughly. Not exactly, but roughly. And so my bad. So I want to start with the Boxer Rebellion, because that was when Russia takes Manchuria right here from China, and that kind of starts their interactions on a kind of an international basis, if I say it that way. They're trying to take power that's outside of what we would call Russia today, trying to take over outside groups. Now, you could argue Siberia was that as well, so don't get me wrong, that certainly is a fair thing to say, but also Siberia wasn't a well-developed, advanced country in the same way we're talking about to the south, so it is a little bit different. 3 years later, the pogroms started. This was basically violent riots to the point of actual outright violence and attacks and the killing of. A pogrom is going to be any group, but in Russia, it was Jewish people. And so they more or less were forcing Jewish people out of Russia. Most of them moved to Europe from Russia, and that will have an impact as we get into World War II. So that's why I'm highlighting it, because that's going to be important as we get into World War II. Around that same time is when the Russo-Japanese War started. So remember, 1900, they take over this, and then 1904, 1905, Japan takes that, as well as some other territory from Russia. So now they're fighting against fighting against Japan. And then in 1905 is when you have the first Russian Revolution. Now, at that time, the Tsar wasn't deposed, so he was still in charge until 1917, but he lost a lot of power. There was a lot of power sharing from that time. And it was really the start of the end for the Tsar, because as that kind of tide turned and as power was moving away from that centralized imperial power to the people, and I say that in quotes because you're going to have two groups fighting in the Russian Civil War that are very opposed to each other. So to say who the people are is a little bit inaccurate. But in between that time, you have Russia entering the World War I, and they entered on the side of the Triple Entente. That's with Britain and France. They had alliances with them. 1917, though, so during World War I is when you have the Second Russian Revolution. So you have the overthrow of the Tsar, and then at that point, basically, kind of shortly thereafter, Russia and Germany have a ceasefire, and they stop fighting. A year later, they actually agree to formalize boundaries. Russia loses a lot of territory, so there's animosity moving forward. There's also just kind of animosity toward what they see as the interference of outsiders, and that's important to understand because it plays into how the USSR then develops, because it's not just a communist revolution, it's also a reaction to foreign interference, is what I'm saying. So you have the Second Revolution in 1917, and you enter this period of civil war where really from that point on, Russia's not engaged with World War I anymore, because from that point onward, you have two armies inside of Russia fighting each other. The Reds, which were the Bolsheviks, which were the communists, led by Lenin, kind of, and a few others. And then you have Whites, the White Army. They're the pro-Western, pro-capitalist side of things, but pro kind of existing power structures as well. So that's the more conservative, not really wanting to change too much, whereas the Red Army was the complete overthrow and the establishment of what would become the USSR. During this time then, when that's happening, now bear in mind, Russia had just allied with Britain and France in World War I. During that time of the Russian Civil War, you can see the Allied interventions. You had Britain, France, the United States, and Japan sending forces into Russia to support the White Army because they did not want the communist takeover. They did not want the Red Army to win. They did not want the Bolsheviks to win. They were not successful, but again, when I'm talking about this mindset of getting outsiders out of the country and being self-sufficient and basically not letting anyone mess with your affairs, All of these things are important. So everything from from Japan taking territory, to Germany taking territory, to the same nations that Russia was just allied with now turning on them and trying to interfere with their internal affairs. All of these things have an impact on the way Russia sees the world and also the way it sees itself. So 1918 is when they agree on borders. I'm going to show you that in a moment. And by 1922, that's toward the end of the Civil War, the USSR was formed, the Reds had the upper hand, and the Reds won. Fast forward to 1941, USSR enters World War II actually on the side of the Allies, the people that they had been fighting against, but, I mean, recently, not before that. In World War I, they were on the same side as the Allies, but in this interperiod, they were fighting against them. So it's just interesting how that kind of trajectory happened. Now, part of the reason why the USSR is going to enter in the way that they did is because Germany attacks Russia again. There's, again, like I said, remember, still animosity for Germany taking its eastern territories. So all of that needs to be understood too. All right, let's talk about China real quick. So China had been under imperial rule since 221 BCE. So over 2,000 years, China was under the rule of some sort of emperor in this kind of imperial system. Different empires, as we've talked about, different rulers throughout, but the same roughly kind of system throughout that time. Remember throughout that time too that for the vast majority of it, China was the advanced power. China was the place, right? But as we get into the 19th century, that has changed. And at this point, China is a weakened state, it's a poor state, and the West is really treating them poorly, right? And we've talked about that a bit. So that starts with the Opium Wars. So the two of those resulted in humiliation and territory loss and lack of kind of financial advantage, or giving financial advantage to the West, however you want to see that, for China. So the Empress Dowager Cixi was in charge during this time. She actually was initially in charge because her son was too young to take over, but she ends up overthrowing him and retaining power. She was the main driver behind the self-strengthening movement. That's part of why you should know who she was historically. But the relevance here is she was a part of that, or the leader of that self-strengthening movement, where, remember, China, or the Qing dynasty, was trying to modernize itself, was trying to westernize itself to varying degrees of success, but that was the goal. Another person you should know is Sun Yat-sen. He's going to be a revolutionary leader as we talk about kind of China moving forward, and these were the years he was alive, so this shows you kind of what was going on during his life. Again, that's why I show you this, so you kind of understand the people relative to the events. So the Sino-Japanese War is the first incursion of Japan into China. Remember, throughout most of this history, the relationship has gone the other way. Throughout most of this history, China was exerting its kind of dominance over Japan. But now Japan's in a position to do the opposite, and they do, and it kind of gets worse from here. In 1900, rebellion, we talked about that before, but that obviously resulted in territory loss as one of the big deals. But it also was a moment of weakness for China, because it showed how easily Western powers could essentially quell a rebellion from inside China and force concessions upon them. So 11 years later, then, you have the revolution that would overthrow the imperial system and form the Republic of China. Now, that's not the People's Republic of China. That's not the current government. That's a different one. This was a pro-Western, pro-capitalist, kind of pro the way the world was kind of going at the time government that was in charge for a while, but ends up being overthrown themselves in a similar kind of way, but not very similar to what we saw in Russia. In 1917, China entered World War I on the side of the Allies. Now that's kind of interesting, because obviously there is this history of Japan and France and Britain kind of, treating them pretty poorly. Japan was on the side of the Allies as well. But if you think about the context of the Republic of China being a pro-Western kind of trying to move China in the way of Westernization government, it makes a little bit more sense that they allied with them. But 10 years later, you have the start of the Chinese Civil War and the eventual, by 1949, overthrowing. So this was a protracted period. This took a while. One thing I want to point out too is both the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China see Sun Yat-sen as a original or founding figure for both of the governments, both of the systems, both of the countries, whatever you want to call it. Both of them see him as a foundational figure, and then from him, that's when things went wrong, is kind of what both sides would say. In 1937 and 1945, you have the Second Sino-Japanese War, so that's during this time of civil war in China, and that's really China's involvement in World War II is what that is. So for a period of time, Japan invades and kind of colonizes, really, China, and again, that's going to influence, just like in Russia, all this foreign influence from the West, from Japan, which is kind of the West now, all of this plays into what would happen next when you have Mao Zedong and the People's Republic of China take over and depose the leaders of the Republic of China, who were then exiled to Taiwan. So you can hopefully see those similarities between the two, is all I'm saying. So by 49, that's who's in charge. That's the communist kind of government that's still in charge today. Kind of communist, kind of not, but we'll talk about that more when we get to systems of government later. But Taiwan is here, so that's where the Republic of China leadership was exiled to. All right, last one. Then we're going to have a brief break, and then I'll do the other two parts on the other side of the break. But the other two parts are kind of shorter. It's not as dense as this, so don't worry that it's going to be literally all this. So in Mexico, you have from 46 to 48 the Mexican-American War that ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That's when the United States gains most of that territory in the Southwest, like we're talking Arizona, New Mexico, California, all that. So up until that point, all of that was part of Mexico. Okay, and if you look at a map today, again, the connections today, that part of the country is disproportionately speaks Spanish. Now, Florida's in that category as well, and that makes sense for a couple reasons, both in terms of history, but also kind of more recent groups that live there. But outside of Florida, the rest of kind of the main naturally Spanish-speaking parts of the country are those parts that were formerly Mexico, because that had taken root there, that was the culture there. Now, obviously, California, Arizona, New Mexico are all fully assimilated now, but it just shows you how those ancestors, their children and their children's children and so on and so forth, lived in those same areas, and that carried through with them through this very day. And it has an impact then on our country today and our kind of forming of government and the way we operate today. In 1857, there was a new constitution that was drafted, similar in the sense that it involved a lot of expansion of rights and protection of rights to what we saw in the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so it's a similar type movement, but just like in the Ottoman Empire, there was resistance to that. So there was really two sides. Basically, the conservatives and the reformists are the easiest way to think about them. And from 57 to 1860, there was a war over whether or not the Constitution was legitimate and whether or not the Constitution would become the law. That ends then with the reign or the presidency of President Diaz. He was a conservative, okay, so he ruled in a pretty kind of firm, traditionalist sense. There was extreme concentration of wealth under his rule. There was also, he was pretty pro-U.S., and so there was the allowing of American economic imperialism all across Mexico that bred a lot of resentment. Think about it. So Mexico's lost a whole bunch of their northern territory, and then for the best part of 40 years, they have a president that's letting Americans kind of do what they want in Mexico and exploit Mexico in many instances. There's a lot of resentment. That brings us to the election of 1910, where Diaz, who initially was not going to run, but then changes his mind, says he is, and that causes its own political drama. He's running against Madero. And Madero is a reformer. He's very popular, and he's so popular, in fact, that in 1910, during the election, Diaz has him put in jail. Okay, so he arrests him and has him put in jail. He eventually goes into exile in the U.S. for about a year. But while he was in jail, he formed this plan of San Luis Potosi, and that's actually basically a blueprint for overthrowing the Diaz government, for a revolution in Mexico, and that's what happened. So in the ensuing years, there was a civil war, there was an overthrow of the Diaz government, and Madero was elected in 1911. He was very popular, like I said. So we enter this period of hope and reform, and we're going to change, and we're going to, kick the American imperialists out, and we're going to be a strong, independent state, et cetera, et cetera. And 2 years later, he's assassinated in a coup. So that's this political crisis piece. So most of it's not to say it was entirely internal. It's not to say that change in Mexico was entirely the result of internal political crisis, but that's the main driver of change. So you did have this external influence, particularly the United States, but the main driver is all of this kind of turmoil. And then when we go from 1913 through 1920, we could do an entire class-long presentation just on this time period. So you had allies, or you had different groups allying with each other, and then those groups fighting with each other, and then some of those groups with each other again, and different people in charge of Mexico, at different points. So it was a very messy period of time from 1913 to 1920, when the kind of more leftist forces were able to successfully kind of win and take control of government in that final coup. During the same time then, in 1917, is when you have the current Mexican Constitution, so the same one that's in effect today was drafted during that time, during that period of civil war. And also in 1917, you had the Zimmerman Telegram, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, but it had an impact on Mexico-U.S. relations, and also Mexico's status in World War I, which they remained neutral. They did provide some support, kind of, for the United States, but they really remained neutral in World War I. In World War II, they did not. In World War II, they entered the war on the side of the Allies. All right.